Hi guys, welcome to the Structural Peace Lab. Many of us here have had a very hectic day, and I'm hoping an intense day, a day when we've been thinking about all that's wrong in the world and how we can become resourced to be a part of the change. And I'm looking forward so much to this session today, which is an intimate and private session with us who are really committed to trying to do this work. Yeah, so welcome everyone. I think we could actually go around the room and introduce yourself, and then I will love to have Reverend Forde to kick us off, and then we'll go into as planned. So, hi, I'm Margaret, one of the founders of Future Law, and this particular lab is very important to me, that we explore these pathways and figure out how we can build bridges and make peace in a very divisive world. And yeah. Delia, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hey everyone, my name is Delia Williams-Gunbutt. I am a research fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University, and an adjunct professor at CUNY, City University of New York. Passionate about helping people become the best versions of themselves. Yeah.
Adam?
Hello. Yes, my name's Adam, and I am a community cohesion facilitator. So for the last 4 years, I've been running a non-profit organisation in the south of England called Ambigo, and it's all about bringing people together from different backgrounds to support each other with their personal goals, ideas and ambitions. And that all came about after a transformation that I had, or transformative experience in Greece, in Lesvos, where I went to volunteer to support refugees, and came back from there absolutely committed to doing something to bringing our communities together. So that's what I set about doing, and I've enjoyed doing for the last 4 years now. Shall I nominate someone?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for co-facilitating there.
I'd love to hear from Christian. Is that how you pronounce it? Do correct me if
Christine.
not. Can you say that again?
Christine.
Christine, it's Christine. Okay, great. Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I'm Christine. I was invited by Yolanda. We know each other from a leadership course that we did. I'm a freelance facilitator and educator, and I do a lot of conflict facilitations. I work a lot with a method called deep democracy, which is around how can we use difference and just become more capable of dealing with the differences between us and using them as a strength rather than as a problem that needs to be solved. And I'm very excited to be here, even if I'm not completely sure what, like I have quite little context. I just trust Yolanda if she says this is something you should be part of, and looking forward to get to know you, but not completely clear on what it is, what we're going to do, but looking forward to hearing more about it. Should I pass it on to somebody? Alicia?
You're on mute, Alyssa. You're still on mute.
There's some setting that it's happening with the mute. Are you all seeing that? People are unmuted. It happened in the last session.
It's for me. It's a little odd because it's two machines. Never mind me. I'm Alyssa. I am in Trinidad. I love puzzles, so I engage with complex systems, whether that is chemical process plants or linguistics. And this is exciting, so I am thrilled to be here today. Nominate Lakita.
Hello, everyone. Oh, let me turn on. I don't know. Hello, everyone. I am Lakita, and I'm also from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm currently studying for the LPC, and I actually joined because I attended the session, I think it was last month that they had, and I was absolutely blown away by the initiative, first of all. So I'm quite excited to see what is coming up. Thank you.
Lovely to have you, Lakita.
Thanks.
No, you can nominate someone else. We're just introducing ourselves.
Okay, then. I nominate, is it Delia?
I think Yolanda is the person left.
Oh, sorry then, Yolanda. I didn't know, I came in late.
That's true, that's true. Why did I do that to you? Yo-yo.
I cannot hear you, Yolanda.
Yeah.
No, you were not on mute, but your sound is not working. Sometimes you have to go out of Zoom again, come back in and say allow microphone to work.
Okay, so while Yolanda tries to sort that out, I would love to introduce Reverend Alicia Forde, who will be our lead facilitator today. And
could I just ask one question? I'm noticing that this is being recorded, and I would like to know who's recording and for what purpose. I'm not sure if that's been addressed.
yes, so this is the Future Law Institute that would be recording this, and this particular segment is not going to be available for public access or for anyone to see after, but it is being recorded for our own purposes because we're developing a program and hoping to develop a program out of this for, yeah? Is that all right with you?
You're only using it for your internal purposes?
Yeah, yes. We're not going to use this part, the labs, where we explore things and experiment with things together. And so, yeah, is that okay, Christine?
Yeah.
I'm sorry we didn't discuss that, but if, yeah, sorry I didn't discuss that with you before. To give you some context, because you did mention at the top, Christine, that you wanted to know a little more. So this lab, the Structural Peace Lab, over the next 5 days, what we are going to try to do is explore different methodologies, different models, different tools for bringing peace internally, between so interpersonally and also at systemic and structural levels. And we have a selection of expert facilitators over the next 5 days to take us through the different models. And most of us who are here are really interested in developing ourselves from the inside out. And so this is the part of the program where, yeah, I think we hope to create a very intimate space among those who join. And yeah, that's what this lab is about. And today we are joined by Reverend Alicia Forde, who is a minister in the Unitarian Universalist Association. And she's the director of the International Office. And she was born in Trinidad and Tobago, but now lives in the United States. And in the context of developing this lab, I connected with Alicia Forde, and I was really incredibly taken aback by how aligned we were in thinking about the source from which we act if we are working in social justice, and if we're working in the fields of how do we alleviate human suffering, and the relationship between that and the spiritual, and the theme of today, that the spiritual is political. And so I would like to just welcome Alicia to this space and have her kick us off. Yeah, Alicia?
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to invite us to start with stillness, because I hear that it's been a hectic day for everyone, starting, Margaret, with you at 7 o'clock this morning, and here you are 7 o'clock at night still going. So if you'd find a spot, a place in your body, in your seat that feels comfortable, I'm just going to ask you to come to your breath. Know that that in-breath reminds us that we are alive. We are in this now, in this moment. And the out-breath reminds us that we are connected one to another. And because we're connected one to another, it feels important for me, at least, to name the ancestors who are accompanying me in this conversation. They are a reminder that I did not create myself, I did not mold myself, but I came into being in community, in deep connection, as part of a lineage. And so I name my mother, Aldith, and my mother's mother, Yvonne, and my great aunt, Tammy. All women full of fierce and good fire. And I offer them my gratitude. I invite you to take one more deep inhale, fueling your being, your aliveness, and then exhale. And before we jump into conversation, I ask that you reach for the chat, and you, if you feel so moved, name the ancestors that you're bringing with you into this moment in time. The people you want to lift up, who you feel connected to, who guide you. And I light a flame in their honor. We welcome these ancestors into this space with us. Amen. So Margaret, I want to extend my gratitude to you for creating this space for conversation and exploration. I think, are we going to spend a few minutes in conversation before I jump in? Because I have about, you invite a preacher to lead a workshop, and obviously I have about 30 minutes worth of things that I want to say. But before I do that, I want to just check in with you and see if there's conversation setting, an actual dialogue that you want to do before I jump in, and then we'll have some time for dialogue at the end.
Yeah, just a couple questions so we could get to know you a little better, Alicia, and what we could expect. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this work?
That is a good and hard question. So you noted that I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. I think I've always had an interest in how we do the work of creating a world in which there's equity. I remember being in high school, I think I was in fourth or fifth form, and the coral reefs in Tobago at that time weren't doing well, and they're still not doing well. And for me, that was family, right? And I couldn't see it as individuals should stop visiting the coral reef. I kept wondering, what were the bigger structures that were allowing that kind of devastation to happen? And I feel like in some way, that's the way my mind has always worked, right? We have some personal responsibility, but then there's also what are the institutional structures that allow or disrupt justice and equity from coming into being? And that was me as a teenager. I was a lot of other things too, but I do remember that specifically. Ministry with the Unitarian Universalists, once I stumbled into it, seemed like a good path for me. It brought together my spiritual interests and my spiritual being, that desire I have to be in relationship with people at the pivotal points in their life with concerns of equity and justice. And that ministry is the container that allows me to do that. I want to say well, but most days it's a struggle.
Yeah, and I think the theme that you've identified for today, the spiritual is political, seeking love and justice in this lifetime. One of the things that we in USolve, as we're developing a radical empathy framework for understanding the other, for conflict transformation and healing personal and interpersonal and systemic trauma, is that we are recognizing the interplay of spirit and heart and body and mind, and how do we bring spirit and come from a place of spirit in the work that we're doing as we apply our bodies. And one of these things that we've come across, a mindset that we've come across, especially in those who are spiritual, is that spiritual, and when we're thinking about peace, is always very calm and zen. And it's almost as if, if you're coming from a spiritual place, there should be no attachment per se to certain kinds of emotional responses. I'm just wondering, in the context of what you're doing with us today, how does that sit with you? What are your perspectives on being spiritual in a material and physical world?
I'm going to address that a little later on, so I don't want to, I'm not sidestepping the question. But if I look at, say, a Christian teacher like Jesus, for example, there is that passage in the Bible in which he goes into the temple and he upturns the table of the money changers, right? And there was nothing calm or peaceful or, to use your language, zen about that, right? For him to live into Christian language, the kingdom of God, meant being able to challenge the status quo. And it's not about removing yourself from society. It's not about taking yourself away from quote unquote worldly concerns. It really is about understanding that our collective liberation depends on all of us to show up, and to show up out of our healing, show up out of our healed places, not out of our wounds. And for me, that's part of where the spiritual comes in, right? We have to do our own inner work, and it cannot stop there, right? It has to be in the service of dismantling the systems that, from my point of view, that the systems that cause harm and cause oppression to others. And Jesus is but one spiritual, one prophetic teacher who lived life in that way. His example was not about removing oneself from society and finding a nice clustered place to retire. It really was about getting in the hard places and challenging and doing the difficult work of bringing about a revolution.
Thanks.
That's my read of the Bible.
Thanks for that. I don't want to keep you too long in this conversation, because I see there's a lot to come. I don't know if anyone else has any questions of Alicia before we jump into what she's going to share with us today. I have a question, but I think I could leave it to the end. Does anyone have a question for Alicia before we start? Okay. The floor is yours. Alicia.
Thanks, Margaret. So, this is morning for me, so I'm raring to go. It's 11 a.m. in Colorado, and I just want to respect that everybody's had a really long day. And so I'm going to ask that you do what you need to take care of yourself. I'm going to be throwing a lot of words at you. And be as present as you can in the conversation. And I certainly understand if you just need to let your mind drift for a few minutes while we're in this. And like Margaret and I both said, there'll be some time for conversation at the end. As I move through, I might be asking you to respond to things in the chat. The invitation is to do that as you feel so comfortable. You can make notes to yourself, or you can put it in the chat. You can put your questions in the chat, and I will respond to them when I'm through. One of the things that Margaret asked for as we were exchanging thoughts on this topic was a practical tool or methodology for transforming race-based conflict. And I want to say that I'm really grateful that this lab will feature practitioners of nonviolent communication, restorative justice, radical empathy, and more. If anyone has tools and methodologies, it will be those presenters. I even heard Adam name that as part of what he does and what he brings. So, I think it would be important for folks to really attend all the lab sessions, in part because if it's one thing I've learned about the work of racial justice over my time in it, is that there's at least in the US, there's a desire for like a 10-point guide on how to do the work. And in reality, what feels true is that the work is just messy, it's heartbreaking, and holds moments of incredible joys and incredible highs, and it can and will turn you inside out. So more than a step-by-step guide, one has to be willing to be transformed. One has to be willing to be transformed and to engage in the difficult work of transforming systems that actively resist being changed. I want to take a moment to note that there's no way for me to remove my history and present context from a conversation such as this. I'm a Black queer woman from Tobago living in the United States. So for me, this means that conversations about race are complicated yet very necessary. It also means that my purview can be extremely limited, since the United States and its sordid history of white supremacy dominates my daily life. And as such, it dominates my thinking and influences my thinking about race. At least two of my deeply held beliefs are that, one, this work of transforming self and systems is spiritual work. It is. And two, we cannot do the work of transformative justice without nurturing our minds, bodies, and souls. To stay engaged in this work, we will need to define our water wells. Those places where we gain sustenance and draw from them regularly and repeatedly if we are to keep our eyes on the prize, to use a civil rights phrase, and not give in to cynicism and despair. So one of my water wells is poetry. I read a poem upon waking every morning. I don't always remember it. And it is a way that I ground myself in my day. I want to share this practice with you as we get started. So this is Paul Robeson by the American poet Gwendolyn Brooks. And Brooks says, "That time we all heard it, cool and clear, cutting across the hot grit of day, the major voice, the adult voice, foregoing rolling river, foregoing tearful tale of bale and barge and other symptoms of an old despond, warning in music words, devout and large, that we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond." If you can hold those words in mind as we move through our time together. In the movement ecology framework, there are three main ways we pursue love and justice. One, through personal transformation. Two, by creating alternative institutions. And three, by changing dominant institutions. For our time together, I will not cover alternative institutions. I'll only say here that it refers to institutions and communities that seek to create change by experimenting with non-dominant, non-normative cultural ways of living. This could range from community gardens in a food desert to intergenerational co-housing to blockchain technology. Those are all examples of creating alternatives to the institutions that already exist. In this session, we'll focus on personal transformation and changing dominant institutions as pathways to love and justice in this lifetime. So Margaret asked sort of what I think about what I not so lovingly call woo-woo spirituality. That's not really fair. But what do I think about spirituality that's kind of divorced from worldly concerns? I want to say that it's often the case that when we think about spirituality and personal transformation, we think about self-help, one's personal faith, or the intense focus on the individual and how the individual might change for their own sake. We might ask, how can I be moved to have a transcendent experience in my life? And in today's economy, spirituality has been packaged, commodified, and divorced from worldly concerns. It's not a mistake that if you go to a bookstore, for example, and look through self-help, you see all of these books about spirituality and finding yourself and so forth and so forth. But it's very focused on the individual. It is often pushed as a quick fix for our anxieties, our inability to sit still, focus, just be with our breath, or it's often pushed as a way that we could be more productive, not just in our lives, but for the institutions that we work with. Spirituality has become synonymous with feeling good, finding individual happiness, productivity, wholeness. It has become, in the popular imagination, something that can be bought, sold, traded, tried on, and discarded at will. I want to be clear that when I use the term spiritual or spirituality, I'm not in fact talking about any of that. I'm referring to our ability to hold a depth of concern for the sentient beings who inhabit this world with us, and our commitment to striving for our collective liberation through living and seeking a radical love and justice in this lifetime. And we seek collective liberation precisely because we are interconnected. What affects one affects the whole. So what does it mean or look like for the self to do this transformational work? Or put another way, in conversations such as this about seeking love and justice in this lifetime, what does a commitment to personal transformation look like? So this photo was taken in 2011, and I have been completely taken by it. In the foreground, you have Christian young people who have formed a chain of protection around Muslims who are in prayer. And for some context, this photo was taken after the event of a bombing in which 23 Coptic Christians died, and Muslims were blamed for the bombing. In this same period, Muslims showed up to protect Coptic churches from attack, and Christians guarded mosques. And in this photo, what you see are Christian young people protecting Muslims as they pray in the midst of the protests in Cairo, protests in which Muslims were being targeted. And what I imagine is that one had to be grounded and clear about one's purpose and hold a deep belief that we all are connected to sort of show up in this way, right? To risk your life to protect the folks who believe differently from you. One had to have worked through at least some legacy of the religious strife between the two groups in order to hold this kind of presence. And for me, it's kind of an example of personal transformation that isn't necessarily only about the self. It's also about being in relationship with the other. It's about honoring, I think Christian said it, you know, we use differences, but as a strength in this moment. The fact that they held different religious beliefs matters, yes, but it also matters that they can show up in solidarity. And for me, that's an example of, you know, what personal transformation, what a commitment to it can look like. Personal transformation recognizes the reality that hurt people, people who are suffering or in pain, people with unaddressed woundedness often inflict harms on others. So healing our wounds and creating the space for doing that work allows us to participate more fully in collective liberation. We're able to show up more grounded, thoughtful, non-defensive, and engaged. And how do we get to this place of healing specifically around race-based traumas and conflict? I'm going to suggest 5 things. This list is not exhaustive. I think this is a group of well-experienced people, and you might have other things to add to this list. So please feel free to put those in the chat, and we can or raise them up in our time after this mini lecture. So say community accountability is part of what it means to seek healing, community and accountability. Find your people. We are each other's harvests, meaning we cannot and do not do this work alone. We need communities that reflect our values and the values that we're aiming to embody, to hold us in care and to hold us in accountability. Education. Engage in your own study, read, seek out movies, podcasts, ask questions, do deep dives, listen to the stories of those who are most impacted by social harms. Know your history and understand your own story. We all carry the legacies of our ancestors and their actions with us. How did your family get to the place where you were born? Who are the ancestors you want to embrace and the ones you'd rather forget? What stories do you want to claim? And what are the stories you want to disavow? Delve into all of them because they live in you and you have to find ways to live with them. Healing from the harms and living from the places that inspire. Understand the story of your country and its history. And this could be your country of birth or the country you've adopted. Who is left out of the popular narratives and why? Whose labor created the wealth of your country? Who owns the wealth and how come? What communities were displaced in the forming of what is now your country? And risk discomfort. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. To do that, you'll need to have your water well, your places of nourishment, those practices that would allow you to stay in your discomfort as you work through your healing, as you reckon with your privilege or internalized oppression. Those practices like stillness, taking a walk, reaching out to a confidant, meditating. The idea is to move toward that discomfort and to discern what it has to teach you. Learn from it, and then put that learning into practice. I call this spiritual work because it is part of the journey to collective liberation, to love and justice. We have to do the work of knowing ourselves, healing ourselves, understanding the legacies of which we are a part, and then work from there. So I'm going to take a pause and then ask for you to note for yourself, either in the chat or on a separate sheet of paper, if sharing at this moment doesn't feel like what you want to do. Note for yourself thoughts on what spiritual transformation might look like in relation to seeking love and justice in this lifetime. What might personal spiritual transformation look like for you? And I'll put that question in the chat. Folks can type in as I move us forward. So it's important to recognize that we're living in a world in which intergenerational trauma is a reality. Wherever there was colonization, wherever imperialism thrived, generational trauma exists. And given that, it's imperative that communities have the resources, education, healthcare, social workers, community accountability structures, nutrition, jobs, to help mitigate and heal that trauma. We heal our wounds and we work with communal structures to heal the wounds of others. So we just took a very quick look at personal transformation, kind of like a big overview. Now I'd like to spend the remainder of our time on dominant institutional change. So allow me to share some thoughts on the fundamental difference between personal transformation and changing dominant institutions, and why we desperately need the latter. I draw on the work of Franciscan priest, Father Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr's language is explicitly Christian, and he makes a vital case. He says, personal sin, which I think of as separation from love and justice, is not the primary cause of malice as much as a result of deeper lies or illusions. Personal sin is committed rather freely because it is derived from and legitimated by underlying unspoken agreements that certain evils are necessary for the common good. However, to be honest, Richard Rohr says, this leaves us very conflicted. We call war good and necessary, but murder bad. National and corporate pride is good, but personal vanity is bad. Lying and cover-ups are good to protect the whole, the institutional church, American self-interest, governments, but individuals should not tell lies. This is our foundational moral confusion, which shows why we must not put all our focus on changing the world at the individual flesh level. Indeed, I believe we must not put all our focus on changing the world at the individual level. Rohr goes on to say, We must first convict evil in its organizational form, not in its adherents who might be quite good and holy, but the glorified organization itself. Then we must consider nation states, war economies, penal systems, the banking system, the pharmaceutical system, etc. They're all, well, many of them, not all, most of them are good and necessary in and of themselves. But when we idealize them and refuse to hold them fully accountable, they become demonic in some form. Anything considered above criticism will soon become demonic. Ours then is the task to seek healing, to be spiritually grounded, yes, and to do so in the service of changing dominant institutions. There is a larger goal beyond the self. We are being called to exorcise the demons of white supremacy and oppression in its many forms. I know many of you do conflict transformation work. And I want to take a moment to interrogate the idea of transforming conflict as it relates to race-based conflict, which is the overarching theme of this lab. How should we define race-based conflict? Can we and should we think about race-based conflict as the havoc and harms caused by systems of white supremacy and imperialism, or more basically, racism? Removing the idea that race itself is the source of the conflict. What's at the root of the conflict between different races? Race, which itself is a social construct around which politics, culture, economics, and social norms are then organized. What's at the root of that conflict is the assertion that whiteness and systems of whiteness are supreme. Now note here that a nation or nation state need not be occupied by white people to be imperialist and assert dominance over others. An example would be, Japan is an imperialist country and exerted dominance over Korea. So a nation need not be occupied by white people to kind of hold that supremacist and imperialist worldview. It's important in conversations like this to get clear too on what we mean by conflict. And for me, asserting my right to exist necessarily creates a conflict for systems determined to erase my being as a Black queer immigrant woman. But here's the reality. I do and should exist. I am not the conflict, nor am I the cause of the conflict. The issue comes down to a society's insistence that some people should be marginalized and should not take up space. And that's problematic. It's also dangerous. When people push against that assumption, that's justice rising. So protesting anti-Blackness, capitalism, white supremacy, racially motivated police brutality and violence, that's justice rising. Agitating for revolution, that's justice rising. Being the cause of another's oppression and perpetuating injustice, that is violent and definitely problematic. The freedom fighter, Frederick Douglass once said, "Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either word or blows or both. The limit of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Now, I want you to understand that in thinking about the conflict that ensues from resisting white supremacy and imperialism, I am not advocating for violence. I am saying that the violence already exists. And those two systems, white supremacy and imperialism, to use Richard Rohr's language, are inherently demonic, inherently violent, and will continue to be so unless they are adamantly resisted. Power concedes nothing without demand. I recently reread Black Theology and Black Power by Dr. James Cone, who is an American theologian. And Cone wrote that book in 1969 in response to race riots, I believe, that took place in 1967. And as I read it today, To read it today is to wrestle with the reality that Cone could have been writing it for us in the United States in 2020. As it relates to conflict, what I heard Cone say in his text is this: if you, white supremacy, have your foot on my neck, your knee on my back, and I throw you off, and you get hurt in my having thrown you off, that is not where the violence lies. The violence is actually in you, white supremacy, having had your foot on my neck and your knee on my back. What is actually required is that the power, white supremacy, remove itself from our Black, brown, and indigenous bodies and begin the work of repentance, hard truth-telling, and hearing, listening. Begin the work of accountability, begin the work of reconciliation, and a wild willingness to share power. My wanting to thrive and oppressed communities wanting to thrive by dislodging the weight of supremacist demons from our being, that's self-preservation. That's love for the oppressed in action. That is God's yes to justice and God's no to chains of white supremacy. I'm often asked, and Margaret, you asked, and I offered a partial answer, do you believe in God? And let me say that the divine for me is what comes alive between two people or in communities living from places of love, justice, creativity, passion. You know, I think something like the Future Lab Institute that we're having right now, negotiating the new normal, is a place where God can come alive as people explore ideas to make the world a better place. That is but one part of who God is. There's another that I subscribe to and I want to speak to, and that is God is love and love is justice, and that's it. If it is devoid of love and justice, then it cannot include God. It cannot be the work of God, and it cannot be God's yes. I'm using theologian Reverend Dr. Carter Hayward's concept of love when I speak of love and justice. And Hayward says, love, like truth and beauty, is concrete. Love is not fundamentally a sweet feeling. Love is active, effective, a matter of making reciprocal and mutually beneficial relations with one's friends and enemies. Love creates righteousness or justice here on earth. To make love is to make justice. To make love is to make justice. Just want you to rest with that for a minute. What this means to me is that the task of exercising our political demons is a spiritual, godly calling. This task of tackling injustice is a spiritual and godly undertaking, and we do not have the luxury of saying no, not if we desire collective liberation. So how do we do this work? I'll speak from my context here in the United States, because to pretend that I can speak to everyone's context and the nuances in the places in which you live would be, one, yes, to pretend. It would also be to do a disservice to your own sense of what is needed in your social location. To do this work of love and justice, we have to keep our commitment to loving in the ways that create justice. So, at the micro level, and this is not an exhaustive list, collaborate with organizations and communities invested in changing dominant systems. Follow their lead. Contribute your gifts, whether that's financial resources or your labor. It is often the case that frontline activists do not have the financial means and or need support in other ways. For example, there's been a huge demand here for trauma-informed therapists to do trauma work with protesters who are in the front lines. There's been a huge demand here for lawyers to work alongside activists as they encounter the court system. If you have the skills, and if you have the gifts and the talents, find where those fit in and support the movement. Work within your institution to request dialogues about race, racism, white supremacy, ethno-nationalism, examine and audit your policies for anti-Blackness, and address systems of institutional oppression. In my own institution, we just completed an audit, I believe 2 years ago, around just looking at the ways in which white supremacy shows up in our work, in the staff, in our HR policies, in supervision. And we're committed to doing that every few years so that we can continue to learn and grow and address the anti-Blackness that is baked into the foundation of our institution. That is the only way that we will get it out. One person, a colleague of mine once said, to say that we have no responsibility for doing this work is like purchasing a house. And on the outside, the house might look great and structurally sound, but the foundation is crumbling. And we have a responsibility now that we've owned the house to attend to the foundation. That is what we have, at least in the United States, a foundation of white supremacy that is affecting every other part of the house. And it's our responsibility to address the foundation. At the macro level, again, this is very particular to where I am located in the United States, and I firmly believe that some of these transfer to other parts of the globe. Defund the police. I think we have a moral and theological imperative to address the level of violence that is perpetrated on oppressed communities, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, not just in the US, but globally. In the United States, what we have are systems whose foundations are built on conquest, on seizure, expansion by any means, and the devaluing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous life in the pursuit of profit. The US has one of the largest and most funded militaries in the world. And what we've done with our military might is wage war in places where Brown and Black and Indigenous bodies are actually meant to thrive. As the organization Faith in Public Life puts it, if budgets are moral documents, when we overinvest in policing, we are saying that God values punishment and surveillance over love and care. It is our moral and spiritual responsibility to push back on that narrative. We cannot be each other's business, belong to each other, and also enact harm. We cannot build the beloved community and practice dehumanization in the name of the state. We cannot recognize the dignity and worth of every person if we create conditions that trap people in situations with no good choices. Demilitarize. It is criminal that the United States spends approximately $700 billion on its military and has been at war almost continuously since the first ships arrived from England. The US spends an estimated $100 billion on their police forces annually, and another $80 billion is spent on incarceration. We only spend about $68 billion on education. It is horrific that teachers are underpaid, and often in elementary settings, they need to provide their own supplies. Classrooms are overcrowded, and at the college level, college students graduate with insurmountable debt that follows them for the rest of their working life. Research shows that investment in education increases positive outcomes for communities. What would the world look like? What would the US look like if that $700 billion, just a fraction of it, went to education? I think eligible US voters should be alarmed that our taxes fund endless wars and police brutality rather than education for the present and for the future, rather than healthcare, rather than addressing poverty, sustainable housing, mental health, retirement. All of these issues, if addressed, will decrease the need for violent policing in communities. I want to amplify something from the Audre Lorde Project, which is out of New York City. I firmly believe that we need to stop the proliferation of anti-Blackness, which itself is intimately bound up with imperialism and legacies of colonialism. It is also inseparable from capitalism, especially in the United States and other developed countries. It is almost impossible in the US to dismantle systems of white supremacy without addressing anti-Blackness and capitalism. I often say that capitalism is a monster with an insatiable appetite. In the United States, you have Black and brown workers who do the majority of low-wage labor, and their healthcare, housing, education, basic well-being are all tied to their ability to produce profits for the wealthy. And this isn't shared profit. It remains in the hands of the few to the detriment of the Black and brown folks who perform labor. Margaret, when we opened up, you asked me that question about spirituality, and I referenced Jesus in the temple with the money changers. And this is a similar example. It's up to us to topple the money changers so that profits can be shared at every level of society, especially with the people who are laboring on behalf of others. I think it would be crucial for white people in particular to reject a system built in their names, reject a system that disadvantages Black and brown people, reject a system that and join the revolution, recognize that there is no single savior and there is no anointed one. It's just us, our hearts, minds, and bodies. We cannot do everything, but each of us must choose to do something that is within our domain to advance our collective liberation. In the US, I say to white people, follow the leadership of Black women, women of the global South. Black women, women of color, women who have been leading from the margins for centuries. Follow the leadership of grounded Black, brown, and Indigenous leaders and use the privilege you have to hold unchecked power accountable, hold elected officials accountable. Use the access that you have to exercise the demons. I want to take a breath here and ask you just to reflect, and you can put it in the chat if you feel so moved. How do you imagine committing to love and justice in your context, especially given Carter Hayward's definition of love? How do you imagine committing to love and justice in your context? Carter Hayward again. Love is active and involves struggle, resistance, risk. Love creates righteousness or justice here on earth. So when we see those who have been systemically marginalized by colonization or imperialism or militarism or war or anti-Blackness or Islamophobia or sexism, or when we see the marginalized and the oppressed showing up, resisting, leading uprisings, toppling the status quo, what we're witnessing is love in action. What we're participating in, if we choose to, and I do hope we choose to, is the creation of justice here on earth. This is what calls to defund the police are about: love and justice. This is what toppling the statues of colonizers and war makers are about: love and justice. This is what this moment, these past few months of justice rising and protest that we have been witnessing in the United States and around the globe are about. It is about making right the centuries of injustice that have stifled so many Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color communities, and making right the injustice that has held hostage our birthright, which is liberation. We were born free. We, all of us, need to ground ourselves in collective liberation, remembering that we are each other's harvest. Without each other, we have no abundance, no plenty. We are each other's business. We are here for each other, and it is our moral duty to make the world a loving and just place with one another and for one another. And we are each other's magnitude and bond. We need not do this work alone. We belong to each other. And in that, there is hope. So Margaret, I said a lot of words, and perhaps this is a good time for us to take a breath and perhaps figure out if there's space for conversation, reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. Thank you for that. And yes, we would like to open up for discourse now and reflections on what Alicia has shared. Yeah, welcome Clyde and Ruth, who joined us a little later on coming down. And for those who've just joined us, this is the first day of the Structural Peace Lab, where we are looking and exploring pathways to peace, and within the context and looking specifically at the issue of racial tensions, issues. I want to thank you for what you shared, Alicia, and I'm still sitting with a lot of what you said, because for me, and I felt I was hearing language that I've been searching for to understand and explain my own rites of passage, my own stuff that I'm going through. So I really thank you for your sharing today, and especially that love and justice slide. Does anyone have questions for Alicia? Let's have a conversation, guys. How does this sit with you? Particularly that concept of love and justice, and also what Alicia has been sharing on how we change dominant institutions and our responsibility in that regard.
Can I ask a question? So I think I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I think it's caused me to think a bit more about what can be done. One of the questions I do have, though, is when it comes to the idea of accountability. So especially with regards to this, the current movement where you have the Black Lives Matter movement that is taking place worldwide. Even in Trinidad, you have people speaking about it. However, what bothers me is, or what I'm concerned about, is whether we're going about it the right way in holding people accountable across the board. So not just for racism, but when it comes to sexual harassment or violence. For me at least, it seems like slapping a prison sentence or taking away their status isn't really getting to the core of it. Canceling people isn't getting to the core of it, because I think it doesn't address the issue that is at the roots. And if we're talking about a spiritual transformation, I would link this to sort of like a child. If a child is being naughty, you take away their toy and you think, okay, well, by doing this, you're gonna learn that you shouldn't do this because then there are consequences. But isn't it better if you explain to them why this behavior is wrong? Because there are people who just don't get it. For whatever reason, I think we're all different. We've all had different experiences. And punishment in the form of removing them from an office or imprisoning them may not get the right message across. It might just create more hate and violence when, you know, in terms of how they respond to that punishment. So my question then is, how do we hold them accountable? What would be a better approach? Because we have been calling people out in the past across the board for many things, but it's still quite pervasive. So we have not made any progress with it. And would it then be more beneficial to look into alternatives and specifically into looking at educating them on why this is a problem? Because while you might say, yes, it's obvious that slavery was wrong or rape is wrong, there are people who have found ways to rationalize these things. And it's bringing them across to seeing why exactly this is wrong. And this is just from what I've seen, I don't see it working to just take away positions. I'm not saying to leave them there, but at the same time, it feels like it just becomes two sides against each other and no one really coming to the middle. So I don't know if you can address that.
I appreciate the question. I think it's a very good one. And I'll say I don't believe in incarceration. If I could abolish prisons with the wave of my hand, I would. Again, speaking from my context in the United States, prisons are a holdover from that period of enslavement. And as a result, their population is majorly Black and brown. And I don't actually think our prisons in the US are geared to rehabilitation or reconciliation. So we could do away with those. I think the question you're asking though is that question of accountability. And I think there are many approaches to kind of what it means to hold people accountable. You named one, education, and education it can start when we're adults, but it also has to start for young people. You referenced rape. We teach young girls to keep themselves safe, right? What do we teach young boys?
Just to cut you right there, that's one of the problems I do have with the system in this country. It bothers me beyond. But that's why I say, like, we're not getting the idea across of this is wrong for this reason. So people can always come with another answer. So for example, and not to switch the topic completely, but when we discuss rape or sexual harassment, you do often hear men saying, oh, but I'm saying it as a compliment to you. You should be grateful that I'm giving you a compliment. And that's missing the entire point. And if we've been talking about this for so long, and this is still the response that we're getting, clearly there is a miscommunication and we need to, regroup and figure out another way to approach it. So continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So, and I would say there isn't actually a miscommunication. There is clearly a system that is built, a patriarchal system that is built to advantage men and to advantage that kind of dominance and to advance that kind of power and stories and to deny women the right to exist on their own. And so that system itself is what is fuel. And this is just an example. We're using an example of sexual harassment or rape. And that is what is fueling this. So for me, education then has to sort of, yes, there's the education that happens in classroom, but then there's a bigger system that needs to be dismantled, and that is the system of patriarchy, right? So what would a feminist society look like? Not like that. It will not look like that. It will actually acknowledge that it doesn't feel like a compliment to me. It would acknowledge that I, as a woman, get paid less than a man for doing the same work. That is a systemic issue, and we would have to address that and dismantle that. And that is a kind of accountability, right? That's a kind of paying attention to the ways in which the system is set up to treat people unequally and then addressing it. So education is one approach. Interrogating systems and sort of figuring out who is the most disadvantaged and oppressed and addressing that is another approach. You referenced call-out culture, and I think call-out culture is probably tricky in a setting like Trinidad and Tobago, where you have two major racial identities. I don't really have any sympathy for white Americans who are being called out. We have tried the other approach. We have tried the nice liberal, let me sit down and talk to you and educate you approach. That doesn't work. I'm not saying call out is a great alternative, but how many times must someone say something nicely and gently and carefully before they lose it? How many times, right? And so I'm not saying it's the right path, but it puts the burden on the person who is continuously being oppressed to be nice, to be forgiving, to be understanding, and it places no responsibility on the person or on the system that is continuously doing the oppressing. And then I completely believe in reconciliation as an approach. And I think there's someone later in the lab who will speak to practices of reconciliation. I think that is an important avenue for how we seek to kind of get on or pursue equity. I will say that reconciliation cannot happen between two parties or amongst parties in which there is unequal power, right? The person who is holding, or the structures that are upholding the majority of power, have to be willing to share, have to be willing to repent. As I said in my talk, they have to be willing to actually do some listening to hard truths. And in my setting in the US, that happens in pockets. It hasn't happened nationwide. And I want to believe that it can and it will, but we're so not there yet. We're so far from that. So Delia, you had your hand up. Oh, you're on mute.
I know, the famous ways. I just want to say thank you, Alyssa. Wonderful conversation. It's like you're speaking my language. I've found my tribe, right? Because my whole thing is that, I am in health education, and, just that declaration of racism, right? As really the cause of all these health issues that African Americans face, that the persistent stresses of operating within the system and mediating racism at all the different levels. It's creating the environment where sickness and ill health abound, right? And you see the injustice, right? And I come from a very, what we call spiritual background, Pentecostal, right? Evangelical here. And when I see the so-called evangelicals, and they're so, to me, anti-Christ, anti the message of Christ, I'm like, where is the love? So this quote, to make love is to make justice, it spoke to my soul, because equity is really because most of the systems of oppression, that's what they lack.
Right.
Equity.
Yeah.
Every single ism is no equity, right? And you just spoke to me, and I just want to say thank you so much for your conversation. That's it. Thanks,
Delia, and thank you for your work in healthcare. It's hard work in the U.S., I believe, that is a front line.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in there, if I may, as well, on the back of that, thinking about to make love is to make justice. And if we're talking about the spiritual being political as well, if we look at New Zealand, we can also see there that not only is it the right thing to do, but it works. So tomorrow, it looks like Jacinda Ardern is going to be re-elected with a a huge win. And there are people that would never have voted for her party before that have seen her leadership, which is all about loving one another, caring for one another, and they've been convinced by it. Because if people can, I don't know if it's a matter of overcoming their own ego for some people, but who doesn't like love? Who doesn't like to be loved? Who doesn't like to be involved in a community where there is love? So it's a really difficult thing to shift that paradigm, the political paradigm of we must have these old white male leaders telling us what to do, basically, because we see that all over the world. Do you, Alicia, feel that the gears are turning and things are changing in a positive way in that regard?
Well, Adam, your microphone is working really well. I just want to note that. Most days I'm a realist. Some days I'm a pessimist. So what I named in the talk that I wasn't going to address alternative communities. And I can say that there are pockets, right? There are pockets of communities in which, you know, I think we get a glimpse of the beloved community, right? You name New Zealand, and I just think that they did such an incredible job of getting people to understand that if I take the step to protect myself, I'm also protecting another. It's through this whole COVID situation. So that feels, in some ways, for our country, it feels really rare. But I think that there are communities in which that certainly happens, right? And globally, I don't feel hopeful. But the thing that one of my core beliefs is, just because I don't feel hopeful and I cannot see the end, and I cannot see the, you know, kind of the glory on the horizon, doesn't mean that I don't do the work, because I am not doing it for me, right? I'm doing it for the generations to come, just like the generations before me did it for me. If anyone in that chain gave up, I wouldn't be here. And they went through some hard stuff, right? Black people don't come from Tobago. That is not where we originated, right? So if anyone on any of those ships any of my ancestors who were kidnapped was like, I'm done, I wouldn't be here. And so I guess, you know, I call on my lineage because someday I'm going to be somebody's lineage, right? Someday somebody's going to look at me and imagine that I hoped them into being. And so that's why, I mean, that's how I want us to think, right? It's beyond the small self. And we might not see the change in our lifetime. And that's actually okay. We still have to do the work. Not sure I got off on a tangent there, but hopefully somewhere in there is an answer to your question.
Oh, it is. I love that. Those kinds of questions have cropped up in my own mind a lot. You know, where is the hope? And if there is no hope, then what? And what you've said encapsulates, I think, you know, how I need to reflect on how I dedicate my energy and how I keep on going, fighting the fight, even when it seems like it's pretty hopeless. Deepa wants to say something.
Hi, Deepa.
Hi, Alicia. I'm going to be a little bit cheeky. Is that all right?
Of course.
I'm wondering about your relationship with forgiveness. And I say it not because I have a understanding of it, but you've been so enlightening on so many levels in this conversation that it feels like appropriate to ask.
Have we talked about this before?
We haven't talked about this before, but let's do it in public, right?
Oh, gosh. I have a complicated relationship with forgiveness. I actually think forgiveness is quite, it is a spiritual imperative. for one's soul to forgive. I believe that. However, I'm going to lean into my context here in the US. Every time there is a shooting, for example, every time a Black body falls at the hands of a white person, there's always this immediate call for the Black community, for the family to forgive. And I am deeply troubled by that. It comes even before they have a breath to mourn. And I think it ignores that it is interpersonal, that harm, right? And you can forgive the person doing the harm. And it ignores the fact that there is a system that upholds that kind of harm. It ignores the fact that there's a system that breeds that kind of violence and contempt for Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies. And it puts the responsibility on those who are grieving to make it better. And I think that is, I was going to say, I think that's unforgivable. I think that is deeply troubling. But if you and I have a thing, forgiveness plays a role, right? If we were a collective, an ongoing collective, and there was some disruption, forgiveness plays a role, right? But I think there are moments in which it is completely inappropriate to ask for it or to expect it. I think the short answer is it's really complicated.
Yeah.
I would love to jump in on that one too, if you all don't mind.
Yeah.
This forgiveness thing is an important and complex question. And from my perspective, I see forgiveness as an imperative as well, from a personal level, at a personal level, for personal freedom from pain and suffering. Forgiveness is an imperative. But for me, when we are thinking about systemic harm and systemic injustice, then calls at a systemic level sends important feedback to the system, which reinforces the system. And I think if we want to dismantle systems of injustice, we can have our personal relationship with forgiveness. However, it comes back to where Laquita started this conversation on the issue of what is accountability really? And, you know, when you're asking that, and my thing was, you know, when we're thinking about accountability from a systemic perspective, there must be consequences if we want the system to change. But I agree, Laquita, that's not all that should be happening, because if the core that is driving the system is not changed, that's the purpose for which the system is operating. So the underlying drivers that are holding the system in place, if they're not addressed, I agree, then we will keep getting it cropping up again and again. But the external systemic response for accountability, the canceling, the calling out, and the consequences for so doing is also important. It's like both have to be happening, the root causes and doing that work, but also correcting the outputs in the system by the appropriate feedback. And so, yeah, that's how I would respond to that. And
Yeah,
I feel
thanks,
very
Margaret.
similarly.
I think in the US especially, it's this thing about there's no justice. Far too many times we do not get justice when Black bodies just lay on the street, and then I'm supposed to forgive. So it takes a lot, and it's almost like, if to use a Trini slang, like it's a papi show, you know, like when when they went into the church and they killed the 6 members,
Yep.
and then I think even before the funeral, the family was like, we forgive him.
We forgive.
I'm like, how can you, like, that you are dishonoring the memory of your ancestors? They're not even in the grave and you're forgiven. You haven't even processed this act.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like it's the victims of the oppression are expected to quickly forgive the oppressors, and that is part of the play of the system, Margaret. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know?
Quickly and publicly.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Deepa, it's a really, it's a profound question for me, because I spent a lot of years as clergy really wrestling with this question, and how do I speak to a congregation about forgiveness when I think, you know, and this was around the Iraq War, just sort of like, yes, I can forgive a soldier, but then what am I saying about the entire system that brought him to that moment in which he killed innocent civilians? Like, and I still wrestle with it, right? Because I think it's a hard message to preach to a congregation. So, Alyssa, you have your hand up.
Yeah, can I jump in? I think there's that the way in which forgiveness is used there is a conflation between forgiveness and absolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think imperative, because for ourselves, we have to release the binding when we hold, to use Margaret's term, bitterness or hate or any kind of anything that impedes our personal liberation, we must release. At the same time, it doesn't mean, as everyone is saying, that people don't face consequences for their actions or that justice isn't done. And it's this odd place where law is supposed to cede to this, you know, milk toast Christianity, which is this, again, we go back, we seem to come back to the woo spirituality, which is this, you know, weak spirituality and not actually robust and fiery love and action, you know.
Yeah.
So
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Alyssa, you have your hand up. I mean, you just
Amanda.
spoke. Amanda.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. I have a couple of questions for you, Alicia. One of the speakers I came across recently is a character you may, well, I'm interested in how you deal with his argument. Of late, Sam Harris has been, well, you know the name Sam Harris. Of late, Sam Harris has been arguing that when you look at the deaths of Black people at the hands of the police in the US, that it's more likely that white people are killed by, you know, he's looking at the statistics, and I feel as if he is, you know, he's very persuasive because of the line of argument he uses. However, I feel as if there's some context missing from what he's talking about. And I'd like to know, how do you deal with his arguments? Yeah. Well, that was one question. I can't remember the other one right now.
You know, Amanda, I'm not actually sure how to answer the question, because I, a long time ago, stopped paying attention to Sam Harris as somebody who courts controversy for the sake of courting controversy. The information.
No, but Alicia, I would just want to say.
Let me answer it this way.
I think, yeah.
The information that I pay attention to tells me that there's a disproportionate number of Black people who die at the hands of police in relation to how many Black people are actually in the population, and same for whites. There's the number of whites who actually die at the hands of the police is a smaller number. And so I'm not sure what he's looking at, but you know, I am almost never persuaded by him because of the way he courts controversy. That's one thing. The other is, I cannot start the conversation at the point at which we're looking at the number of deaths. I have to start the conversation at the point at which we're looking at why the police exists and how it came to be, and the history of policing in the United States. And the history of policing in the United States says that it grew out of a legacy of a legacy of enforcing slavery. So police and police patrols grew, that system grew out of recapturing enslaved people and returning them to plantations. That is the basis, right, for policing in the United States that has just grown throughout the centuries. So it's one thing to start where we are now, but it's another thing to go back and look at the role that police has always played in US history and kind of how we got here to this kind of blatant devaluing of Black and Brown and Indigenous life. Margaret tells me I have about 3 minutes, so I cut you off and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
I was just going to say that from the occasions that I've heard him speak, which is not very many, just once or twice, he does strike me as sincere, which is scary. Yeah. And the second thing, well, if you only have 3 minutes, maybe I should stop. Yeah.
Send me an email.
and we can continue the conversation over the next 5 days. We do want to stop. It's been a long day for everyone, but I mean, I really am grateful, Alicia, for the tone that you set at the beginning of the Structural Peace Lab. We are looking each day at a different aspect of the human experience. And today we started with spirit. And I feel so pleased that you place spirit in the context of what it is to be human, as opposed to the disembodied spirit. You know, some of us focus on the disembodied mind. There is also the concept of disembodied spirit that I think fuels this woohoo, you know, Zen sort of spirituality. But spirit in the context of human body, I really appreciate so deeply how you, this powerful and beautiful lesson to us. And I'm hoping that each of us, as we start this lab, starts with this context, understanding that there is a spiritual part in all of us, as Reverend Alyssa has said. And with that, and this is my takeaway, and I would invite everyone to think about what your takeaway is from this lab today, and bring it with you tomorrow. My takeaway is that with spirit, understanding the interconnectedness between all of us, there comes a responsibility. That's my takeaway, and that responsibility to love. And if my fellow man is being harmed and is suffering, the responsibility of love is justice. And so I'm really grateful for that. I don't necessarily need to end this lab on my words. So if anyone would like to share openly what they're taking away from this lab tonight before we close, that would be wonderful. And I think it'll be a wonderful gift to Alicia as well. Really grateful, Alicia. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Margaret.
So for me, I always have been taught to replace love with God, right? So if God is love, and love is to make justice, then God is justice.
Yes.
So when we're doing the work of justice, we are doing God's work. It's just beautiful. Thank you.
Miss Delia.
Ashe, guys. Ashe. I hope to see all of you joining us again tomorrow when we are going now into the mind. So we started with spirit, and tomorrow we're going into mind as we go a little deeper into how do we communicate with ourselves? How do we unpack how we communicate with ourselves and others up here, right? To transform and resolve conflict. And we have Sophie Docker tomorrow taking us through some developing work in the nonviolent communication field. It's developing and emergent, where they're now trying to far more robustly apply nonviolent communication to systemic oppression.
Great.
So pretty exciting. And Rev, I don't know if you had made the time to come tomorrow, but if you could, we would love it. I know it's a bit tough, but yeah. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming and being a part of this lab.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's been just a wonderful time to be with all of you. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bless. And to those who came in at the end, join us tomorrow, same time, not the time you came in, right? So it's 5:30 BST or 6:30 CET. And we'll have another beautiful exploration of another aspect of ourselves and how we deal with conflict. Okay, love all.